Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Washington Brief for Tuesday, January 3rd, 2023. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News Organization. He has led numerous fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that meet with the legislative, executive, intel, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins is an experienced organizer of peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all you do at the Washington Times Foundation. We have a wonderful program at this time. We are looking at North Korea again, and the title is North Korea Ups the Ante in the Strategic Standoff. Our moderator today is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Ambassador DeTrani is a commentator on security issues and former special envoy for negotiations with North Korea and the former director of National Counterproliferation Center. Ambassador DeTrani is also the former Associate Director of National Intelligence and Special Advisor to the DNI. Prior to that, he was a senior official at the Central Intelligence Agency. He currently is a professor of the Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Missouri State University and an advisor to Sandia National Laboratories, as well as a fellow at the Institute of Korean American Studies and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Our panelist today is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's president and CEO of Great Falls Solutions, a very effective consulting firm, and senior associate at Illumina Insight. He's founding member of the U.S. National Committee on North Korea and is frequently interviewed as an expert on North Korea. He's one of the very few people that holds a degree from the Kim Il-sung University, as well as Moscow State University and his Columbia University, where he got his PhD. And our special guest speaker today, we're honored to present to you Admiral Harry Harris. Admiral Harris was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, PACOM, from 2015 to 2018, became the ambassador to the Republic of Korea 2018 to 2021. Widely regarded for his leadership, Admiral Harris was selected to serve by two presidential administrations. First, to lead in one of the military's most challenging roles at a critical time when the U.S. confronted the rise of new world powers and nuclear threats, and later as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea. With close to half a century of public service, commanding highly complex, high-stakes organizations and advancing international relations, Admiral Harris offers a rare perspective on leadership, geopolitical affairs, and current events in a way that only an American diplomat and former admiral could possibly do. Admiral Harris took command of U.S. PACOM in 2015, the oldest multi-service command that stretches from California to the Indian Ocean and from the Arctic Sea to Antarctica. As commander, he ensured America's joint forces were postured and prepared to support the Combined Forces Command in South Korea against aggression from the North. He was the first American of Japanese descent to lead the U.S. Pacific Command and the highest ranking Asian American in the history of the United States Navy. Prior to leading U.S. PACOM, Admiral Harris served in a variety of roles with the U.S. Navy, including as representative of the chairman of the Joint Staff, Chiefs of Staff to Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. As a naval flight officer, he served in every geographic combatant region and participated in several major operations, including Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, Odyssey Dawn. In total, Admiral Harris has logged 4,400 total flight hours, including more than 400 combat hours. He retired the from the military as a four-star admiral in June of 2018. Following his retirement, he was sworn in as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea, serving in that position until 2021. As ambassador, he ensured the White House's positions on numerous issues, including the U.S. Republic of Korea Special Measures Agreement, the UN sanctions regime against North Korea, and inter-Korea dialogue, and the administration's concern about the threat of the People's Republic of China, where these were clearly understood by the Blue House. He promoted American business interests in South Korea amid deepening economic ties between the Republic of Korea and the PRC. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and a Council of American Ambassadors. For his service, Admiral Harris has been awarded numerous medals, including the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, the CIA Agency SEAL Medal and Ambassador's Award, 2 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, 3 Navy Distinguished Service Medals, and 3 Legions of Merit. We are very honored to present to you Admiral Harry Harris, and I will turn it over to our moderator, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Joe?
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you. And we're so honored to have Admiral Harris with us today. There's so much to talk about. Let me just sort of set the scene by saying, indeed, we just saw over the last few days, over the New Year's, 3 short-range ballistic missile launches, added to 70 ballistic missile launches in 2022 by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And we just heard over the last few days at the plenary session of the Workers' Congress that Kim Jong-Un made it very clear that North Korea will exponentially increase its nuclear arsenal. They'll mass produce tactical nuclear weapons, spoke of South Korea as the enemy, the United States as the hostile forces, and talked about a NATO-like and organization in East Asia that obviously would be confronting the DPRK. There's so much to talk about on North Korea, but indeed there's so much going on in China, with Taiwan, so much going on with the Ukraine war, so much happening in Iran with the demonstrations that are going on, Myanmar, etc. So today we're so fortunate to have Admiral Harris, who could put this all together for us. And then we could just open it up to dialogue with Dr. Mansourov and myself, and hopefully we will better engage with our audience out there and then hear your response. Please write to us, write to the Washington Times Foundation, and let us know what we're missing and what more we should be doing to better discuss these important issues. Over to you, Admiral Harris.
Well, thanks, Dr. Jenkins, for the introduction, and thanks to the Washington Times Foundation for putting on this very timely podcast. I'm honored to join Ambassador DeTrani, and Joe, thanks for setting the stage here, and Drs. Mansourov and Jenkins this morning. Gentlemen, it's good to be with you again. A year ago, when I spoke at this webcast, I spoke to a dozen or so topics. Today, I plan to talk about 3 big things. First, the Korean Peninsula. Second, China, or the PRC. Then I'll close with some comments on Russia, Ukraine, and how that ties in with the China-Taiwan issue. So let's get to it. The Washington Times is known for straight shooting. So point blank, I believe in 2023, we're at an inflection point in history. We're certainly not near anything resembling the end of history. Freedom, justice, and the rules-based system hang in the balance, and the scale won't tip of its own accord simply because of wishful thinking. President Reagan once said that we cannot play innocence abroad in a world that's not innocent. This statement is as true today as it was in 1941 through the Cold War, on 9/11, and on the 24th of February of last year when Russia invaded Ukraine. The world remains a dangerous place. The unipolar moment following the Cold War is over. We find ourselves again in peer competition with adversaries who are developing and deploying cutting-edge weaponry, including hypersonics, to defeat us. North Korea is building and testing nuclear weapons, Taiwan is under siege, and Ukraine is ablaze. We are in what I call the decisive decade. Now, I'll be a little bit more provocative this morning and observe that many seemingly disparate events are converging with Ukraine as the nexus. As my colleague, Dr. Mansourov, has suggested, destabilization itself has a tipping point. I believe we might be approaching such a convergence in 2023. So while our opportunities remain abundant, the path ahead is burdened by several considerable challenges, including an aggressive North Korea, a revisionist People's Republic of China, and now a revanchist Russia. Last fall, the Biden administration finally released its national security strategy. This strategy underscores that America's vital interests in an Indo-Pacific region that's open, interconnected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. It calls for leveraging all elements of America's national power to outcompete strategic competitors, tackle shared challenges, and shape the rules of the road. Though I would use the term adversary rather than competitor, this strategy recognizes that the PRC is the only competitor with both the intent and increasingly the capability to reshape the international order. It emphasizes that America's single greatest asymmetric strength is our network of security alliances and partnerships. And the strategy calls for modernizing our bilateral defense treaties with Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, while advancing our major defense partnership with India. Now, the textbook case in point is the U.S.-South Korea alliance, which will be 70 years strong this year. Forged during a devastating conflict, it has stood the test of time. It's mind-boggling to consider how much has changed in the world in general, Northeast Asia in particular, and the Korean Peninsula especially, since 1953. Some changes have been for the better, such as South Korea's miraculous growth into an economic and cultural powerhouse, a vibrant democracy, a high-tech innovation nation. Other changes have been for the worse. Why is North Korea, far away in Northeast Asia, a challenge for the entire world? The answer is simple. Kim Jong-Un's missiles point in every direction. Today, North Korea stands out as the only nation this century to test nuclear weapons. North Korea is ruled with an iron fist by a brutal dictator who values power over the prosperity and welfare of his own people. The North's unrelenting pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, and its unmitigated aggression towards the South and to the United States should concern us all. Now, let me emphasize to our listeners that the U.S. stands firmly with South Korea and is firmly committed to the alliance. This is important because North Korea and the PRC will continuously test our resolve to weaken our strong ties in order to divide us. Now, I believe the KGU wants four things: sanctions relief, to keep his nukes, to split our alliance, and to dominate the peninsula. The IAEA is concerned about the trajectory of North Korea's nuclear program. The U.S. intelligence community assesses that KGU views nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent against foreign intervention. KGU declared last year that he'd be willing to employ nukes more broadly in wartime. And last September, he stated unequivocally that he'd never give up his nukes, and the North Korea status as a nuclear weapon state is irreversible. Now, finally, lest you still need convincing, as Ambassador DeTrani said, at last month's Central Committee plenum, KGU declared his intent to exponentially increase his country's nuclear arsenal and develop a new ICBM. That doesn't sound to me like he's going to get rid of his nukes anytime soon. In fact, he's telling us precisely the opposite. Now, while we hope for diplomacy with North Korea to be successful, we must recognize that hope alone is not a course of action. The quest for dialogue with the North must never be made at the expense of the ability to respond to threats from the North. In 2022 alone, the North has launched 70 missiles of increasing complexity. Just last month, we saw multiple drone incursions across the DMZ. Now, should we be concerned about drones in 2023? Well, when you consider the devastating impact of drone warfare on the battlefield in Ukraine, are drones over the DMZ simply business as usual, or is it the beginnings of high-tech, unmanned, and smart warfare on the Korean Peninsula? Clearly, this is no path towards peace. Dialogue and military readiness must go hand in hand. Idealism must be rooted in realism. We must not relax sanctions or reduce joint military exercises just to get North Korea to come to the negotiating table. This is a fool's errand. Gentlemen, I believe our heretofore U.S. policy goal of negotiating away North Korea's nuclear program has reached its useful end. We must up our combined game. Deterrence by appeasement is not deterrence at all. Now, I'm encouraged by the new administrations of President Yoon Suk-yeol in Korea and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in Japan. Their meeting, albeit short, in New York last September was both welcome and long overdue. Let me add how encouraged I am by President Yoon's intent to make the U.S.-South Korea alliance the centerpiece of his foreign policy. Now, I'm pleased that he places a primacy on defending South Korea against the threat from the North, which means a return to joint military exercises and an emphasis on combined readiness. And I'm impressed by the first-class foreign policy team he's assembled, including Foreign Minister Park Jin and Ambassador to Washington Cho Tae-yong. Now to the elephant in the virtual room, and that's the PRC. Let me mention Speaker Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan, all the brouhaha that preceded it, and China's truculent behavior that followed it. Now, let me be clear. I supported her visit before she went, and doubly so after China threatened her, Taiwan, and the United States if she went. And if Rep. McCarthy becomes the next speaker, he's promised a similar trip to Taiwan and soon. There are very few bipartisan issues in Washington these days, but our national concern about the PRC is one of them. As Michelle Flournoy recently said, quote, there is a strong bipartisan consensus in seeing China as the pacing threat economically, technologically, diplomatically, and militarily, unquote. And I was often asked when I served in Seoul whether South Korea was being forced to choose between its own security ally and its number one trading partner. This is a false narrative designed to sow doubt about the history and the strength of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. The U.S. made its choice in 1950, as did 15 other sending states where we committed troops to defend the South against the communist invasion from the North. South Korea made its choice in 1953 when it formally allied with the U.S. and aligned with the West. Now, to be clear, the U.S. has partnered well with China on several important fronts, but Washington and Beijing fundamentally disagree on how to approach the current international order. The PRC doesn't keep its word, from its treaty with the British on Hong Kong to its human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others, to its attempts at commercial espionage and its quest to intimidate, isolate, and finally dominate Taiwan. As I testified before the U.S. Senate when I was in uniform, I believe Beijing seeks hegemony not only in East Asia, but greater Asia and beyond. The PRC wants to set the rules for the region, indeed the world. Now, the U.S. has made it clear that we reject foreign policy based on leverage and dominance. The U.S. won't weaponize debt. We encourage every country to work in its own interest to protect its own sovereignty. And we must work in our own enlightened self-interest to develop our own reliable sources of critical materials, including rare earths, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals essential for weaponeering, independent of the PRC. Gentlemen, we find ourselves sailing in the rocks and shoals, to use a nautical analogy, and we must invest and innovate to right the errant course we're on. Now, I note that the Biden administration's fundamental understanding of the PRC is consistent with its predecessor. Consider the Secretary of State Blinken testified that the previous administration's tougher approach is right, that what's happening in Xinjiang is genocide, and that democracy is being trampled in Hong Kong. Secretary of Defense Austin testified that he's focused on the threat posed by the PRC, and he promised strong support for Taiwan. Look, Taiwan is democratic, an idea factory, and a global force for good. I've called for ending the almost 44-year U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity in favor of strategic clarity. The new Indo-Pacific strategy specifically supports an environment in which Taiwan's future is determined peacefully by the Taiwanese. What a concept. My successor at Indo-Pacific Command testified before Congress in 2021 that the PRC could invade Taiwan in 6 years. That's 2027. We ignore Admiral Davidson's warning at our peril. Now, despite the economic calamity wrought by Beijing's zero COVID policy and own goal, if there ever was one, and the ongoing public health disaster due to COVID resurgence in China, I'm worried about the trajectory of the PRC's body politic. As former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd recently wrote, last October's 20th Party Congress is likely to be, in his words, and I quote, an era-defining event, cementing Xi Jinping as China's paramount leader, solidifying the country's turn to the state and away from the market. I'll say that again, solidifying the country's turn to the state and away from the market, and officially underscoring the primacy of Marxism-Leninism, unquote. In other words, Deng Xiaoping is dead in more ways than one. If the first era of modern Chinese politics was Mao Zedong's, and the second, Deng Xiaoping's, the third is unquestionably Xi Jinping's. Now, let me wrap this up by spending a few minutes on Russia and Ukraine, but first acknowledging the unconscionable human tragedy that's being perpetuated by Russia in Ukraine. As Gary Kasparov recently said, Russia is committing war crimes in Ukraine on an industrial scale. So why does Ukraine matter? Well, consider that Ukraine is a democracy and the second largest country in Europe after Russia. Consider that Ukraine sent forces to Afghanistan in support of NATO, even though it's not in NATO. Consider that Ukraine sent troops to Iraq, where they fought and died for coalition objectives. And remember, in 1994, Kyiv voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons after the Cold War at the behest of the West. So why did Russia invade Ukraine at all? Well, in two words, Vladimir Putin. Maya Angelou once said that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Folks, time and time again, Putin has shown us who he is, and shame on us if we fail to believe it. In my opinion, he seeks to rebuild the former Soviet Union, not under communism, but to its old borders. Us geopolitical geeks have a term for this, revanchism. So Kazakhstan, Georgia, Moldova, of course, Ukraine, and others are at risk. The Baltics too, but they're part of NATO now, and that's a different nut for Putin to crack. And why now? In my opinion, opportunism. Putin saw the West as weak, distracted by the pandemic. He saw America's political divisions play out in Washington, and he watched their end game in Afghanistan. But he miscalculated, and stunningly so. He underestimated Ukraine's resolve. He might not believe that Ukraine is independent, but the Ukrainians sure do, and they're willing to fight and die for their country. He underestimated the former comedian and everyman who became the president of Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky has risen to his office in truly Churchillian fashion. Putin underestimated the resolve of the international community to break Russia's economic backbone. Yale School of Management recently concluded that over 1,000 companies have curtailed operations in Russia, and Yvonne Lau recently wrote in Fortune magazine that Russia is headed toward economic oblivion. Putin underestimated NATO's resolve, especially Germany's, and he underestimated America's resolve to come together to support Ukraine with our bipartisan political determination. On the other hand, Putin overestimated his own strategy, a fantasy of his own making, that Russia could blitzkrieg Ukraine in 15 days. It's now been 10 months. He overestimated the strength and the capability of the Russian army. What we're seeing play out on the battlefield are poorly trained troops led by some very bad generals. And I'll just note that there's nothing admirals like doing more than criticizing generals, without adequate enabling logistics and no understanding of combined arms. It was German General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, who famously said that logistics is the ball and chain of armored warfare. Now, numbers are uncertain at best, but I've seen reporting that in 10 months of hard fighting, Russia has lost as many as 80,000 troops, thousands of tanks and armored fighting vehicles, hundreds of aircraft, and, according to the New York Times, as many as 12 general officers. The success of the ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia's reliance on Iranian drones and possibly North Korean artillery shells, and Moscow's call-up of new troops demonstrate the inherent rot in the Russian military. An exiled Russian oligarch recently said the young men are fleeing Russia, not because another country invaded them, but because Russia invaded another country. And if Putin had gone to my alma mater, he'd know strategy lesson 1, don't lose your flagship. This is not Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. This is Finland, 1939. Russia's actions strengthened and unified, not weakened and divided NATO, the EU, and the UN, as well as brought together a divided Washington. As Icelandic foreign minister said last year, thank God we're in NATO. And now Finland and Sweden have applied to join NATO, the exact opposite of what Putin believed would happen. In other words, he failed spectacularly, notwithstanding a certain inevitability simply because of the mass of the Russian military. Stalin apocryphally, and I say apocryphally because he didn't really say it, quantity has a quality all its own. Again, Finland, but this time 1940. But don't be like Putin and underestimate the resolve of the Ukrainians. George Shultz once said that he who walks in the middle of the road gets hit from both sides. I'm proud that the United States has chosen sides on Ukraine. So far, the U.S. has provided billions in aid to Ukraine, including key military hardware such as Stinger, anti-air and Javelin anti-tank missiles, Switchblade drones, howitzers, HIMARS, helicopters, and soon Patriots and the Vampire anti-drone system. Even so, there's more juice in that orange. As SecDef Austin has said, we must move at the speed of war to help Ukraine, even as our industrial base finds itself hard-pressed to backfill what we've already given to Kyiv. Finally, we must continue to expose Putin's war crimes to global audiences, including and maybe especially audiences in Russia. None of this is easy, but if we don't act with urgency, we'll find the outcomes more dire and the options more dangerous. Of course, Putin gets a vote, and if Russia votes with tactical nukes, chem bioweapons, attacks against NATO countries, cyber attacks on America's critical infrastructure, then all bets are off. Even Putin isn't this crazy, I hope. So this brings me full circle to the issue of Ukraine and the implications for Taiwan. Hard to say where Beijing will land, but Xi Jinping is no fool. He craves stability in the international order so that he has time to shape that order in his favor. The very things that he seeks to weaken, the West, the US, the UN, our alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia are coming together with Ukraine as a catalyst. While supportive of Russia, the PRC is far from all in on Russia. You can be assured, however, that Xi Jinping is watching Ukraine closely and learning. He's learning that control of the internet is vital. And I believe he's wondering. He's wondering how his military, untested and sustained combat operations since the Korean War, would fare in a modern 21st century war. He's wondering if his army, trained in the Soviet model, is as bad as Russia's appears to be. If his generals and admirals, again trained in the Soviet model, are as inept as Russia's appear to be. He's got to be wondering if his Navy is as vulnerable as the Black Sea Fleet appears to be, and if he can first replicate for himself, then overcome the amazing American logistics machine. As my colleagues on this panel know, for years I've sharply criticized the PRC for its lack of adherence to international rules and norms, even those rule sets that it has signed on to. Well, in 2013, Xi Jinping himself and then Ukrainian President Yanukovych inked a bilateral treaty whereby the PRC pledged to provide Ukraine with a nuclear security guarantee whenever Ukraine faced an invasion involving nuclear weapons or even the threat of nuclear weapons. Must have been inked in invisible ink, I guess. Gentlemen, I've talked too long. I look forward to discussing these and other topics with you and the audience. Back to you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Admiral Harris. That was excellent. Thank you. There's so much to unpack in that. Talked about Ukraine, certainly China, Taiwan, what's happening in North Korea, the threat to South Korea, and the world writ large, to include certainly the United States. So we'll look to Dr. Mansourov for his comments and some questions, and then let's open it up for dialogue. Dr. Mansourov.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and good day, everybody. This was an amazing, fantastic tour of the horizon. It's an awesome presentation. It's a very hard, it's very hard to follow in the Admiral's footsteps because you've done such an amazing job with your overview of the strategic horizon for all of us. But let me begin by saying a Happy New Year to all of you. I hope that the coming year will not be as bad and even awful as the year which we just sent away. I'm glad that Korea finally opened up for business last year, and that the Washington Times resumed its world summits in Seoul, as well as our fact finders last year. So again, I'm looking forward to having many, many more world leadership conferences, world summits, and fact-finding missions as we go forward. But let me begin by summarizing a few things, a few important developments from the last year, and then talk a little bit about the disappointments, and then, of course, I'll ask a couple of questions with our chairman's permission. I'll be very brief. I'll highlight three key developments on and around the Korean Peninsula, because that's our focus. First of all, in my opinion, despite all predictions to the contrary, Kim Jong-un's regime survived last year. International sanctions, COVID-19 pandemic, the international isolation, floods, they all failed to collapse, to cause any much difficulties, or let alone the collapse of the North Korean regime. Yet again, it's proved to be stable, much stabler than most people expected, and quite durable. That's number one, not good news. Number two, even worse news, and that is, as Admiral suggested, the North Korean threat, conventional nuclear missile threat, significantly increased last year, despite the pandemic, despite everything. Why? First of all, because of the steady advances in the nuclear missile programs in North Korea, and the general talked about some of the examples of that. Number two, because of the adoption of a new doctrine, which is much more aggressive nuclear doctrine, emphasizing the preemptive nuclear strike and the irreversibility of the nuclear capabilities. And of course, a significant increase in the North Korean cyber threat. Now, believe it or not, last year, the Kim Jong-un regime collected or stole almost $800 million through cyber means. I mean, the North Koreans are getting so much better in cyber theft. And finally, the third major development, in my opinion, is the fact that North Korean international position, again, in my analysis, improved last year, despite all the efforts of the United States and its allies to undercut it, and primarily because of strengthening alliance between North Korea and China, because improving relations between North Korea and Russia. And we see that the result of that is the fact that the UN Security Council was not able to act at all, despite those 70 missile tests, despite highly provocative behavior. The international community, again, for the reasons unrelated to North Korea, but related to global politics, failed to act. So these are the major kind of results for me of the last year. There were some big kind of misses and disappointments as well, and I'll mention just a few. The first one is startling to me. All the predictions by the US and Western intelligence communities about the so-called imminent nuclear test by North Korea, the 7th nuclear test, they proved to be wrong. I mean, I'm learning the new meaning of the word imminent. It's getting stretchable. That's number one. Number two, unfortunately, and that's a major disappointment in my book, at least, the Biden administration's decision to abandon the freeze for freeze deal, which was put together by President Trump and Kim Jong-un, backfired. Now we have more military drills on the US rock side, and many more North Korean missile tests. So as far as I'm concerned, it's better if we had that freeze for freeze deal in place and working from there, as opposed to the situation in which with which we have to deal today. Now, as you know, another disappointment, at least to me, has something to do with the change in policy in the South. The Republic of Korea now has a new president. President Yoon was elected last May and decided to switch to a different policy, to a much more hardline policy in dealing with the North. And we know that that, in my opinion, resulted, as expected, in a change, in the fundamental change in North Korean policy as well. Now we have a much more hardline policy from the South. Again, no surprise here. A switch to hardline on one side causes even more hardline on the other side. Again, it's a chicken and egg dilemma. Who did it first? I don't want to argue about that, but clearly, that's what we see. A much harder line policies pursued by two Korean states. And finally, again, another disappointment for me from the last year was the fact that the United States and South Korea failed to entice or compel, whichever word you prefer, North Korea to return to the denuclearization talks. Now, Pyongyang basically has a free hand in pursuing its nuclear and missile programs at will. The way it looks to me now is that the diplomacy is dead. I don't see any prospects for the resumption of the six-party talks, to be honest, and any other initiatives like the revival of the summit diplomacy between the North and South in the future. So the diplomacy is dead, and that's very frustrating and sad in a way, because we see what happens in Ukraine, for example, as a result of the collapse of the Minsk agreements. I'm not going to talk about the Ukrainian situation at all, but the human tragedy which we see there is mind-boggling. I mean, the human toll on both sides is unbelievable. Admiral mentioned the human toll on the Russian side. I mean, on the Ukrainian side, it's at least double that number, and that's just killed in action. And if you add all the missing and wounded, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people now dead. Unbelievable damage to the civilian infrastructure, huge economic costs of that war. And that's all, in my opinion, the result of the failure of diplomacy. And so if we allow, that situation that, our diplomats basically wash off their hands, give up, throw in the towel, and decide that there is nothing else they can do in the Korean situation and just let it pretty much go into the free fall, the human toll of the Korean tragedy would be no smaller than what we see in Ukraine today. So that's enough for my kind of observations. Now let me ask, with Chairman's permission, a couple of questions of our distinguished guest speaker, who made, again, an amazing overview of the strategic landscape. And the first question is simple, but it's important in light of what we observed in the past few days, and that is the drone warfare. I mean, you alluded briefly in your presentation that this may be just a regular provocation, which we saw last week, but maybe it's the beginning of a new age of unmanned, smart kind of warfare, which might come to the peninsula, whether it's the armed unmanned aerial vehicles, whether it's robotized artillery guns or tanks, or whether it's robot submersibles, whatever. And as you know, the South Korean defenses proved to be ineffective against that intrusion. It led to domestically, in terms of domestic politics, mutual accusations between the Yoon and Moon administration, blaming each other who did what. And of course, the South Korean defense minister apologized, but then the public was harshly critical of the inability of its military to protect. Even Seoul, northern Seoul, that's where one of the drones was detected. Again, there are some technical issues why, the South Korean military could not do its best to counter that threat at that time. But my question to you, as a former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, as our ambassador in Seoul, is very simple. Are we ready? Are we ready for the drone warfare on the peninsula, or does the alliance need to do more in terms of its military drills, in terms of its training, in terms of its technological developments to prepare for this threat? I'll stop here, Ambassador, and then I'll come back with other.
Thank you, Dr. Mansourov. Please, Admiral.
Sure. I'll just answer Dr. Mansurov's question briefly. Clearly, a single incident of a drone flying across the DMZ is of some concern, but not great concern. However, as I mentioned in my remarks, and as you alluded to, we're seeing drone warfare play out in broad swaths on the battlefield in Ukraine, and we're learning of the great effectiveness of that, both against Ukraine and just in the last couple of days, the drone response against Russian forces there as well. And we've had drones on the battlefield in Afghanistan and Iraq for over a decade now. So we in the United States are clearly understanding of the potential for the threat posed by drone warfare. I think, however, that what we're seeing play out is what you suggested, Dr. Mansourov, and that's this new age of unmanned smart warfare on the battlefield in South Korea, in North Korea, on the Korean Peninsula. So clearly, as I mentioned in my remarks, we have to up our combined game. In this case, that means anti-drone warfare systems have to be in place in Korea. I won't say whether they're there now or not, but we clearly need to have them there, and the rules of engagement have to be discussed and war gamed so the commanders on the ground at the tactical level know how to respond and not have to seek permissions, which could take hours, if not days, to get, and by then it's too late. So what I think the North has provided the South in this case, and against the backdrop of what we're seeing play out in Ukraine, is that North Korea has demonstrated to the South the need for the South and the alliance to get better in this warfare area. So thank you, KGU, for giving us that insight. And I'm sure that the combined forces under General LaCamera in South Korea will rise to the occasion.
And just a quick follow-up, as we know, most of the drones, which at least the Russian forces are using in Ukraine, they came from Iran, which again was able to develop a very advanced capability in this areas. How worried are you about the potential Iranian-North Korean cooperation in the drone development? We know Iranians flew a bunch of transport aircraft to Russia, unloaded, thousands of drones were there, and they're being used now to a huge detriment on the battlefield. So are you worried about the Iranian-North Korean cooperation in this regard, and what can we do to stop it?
Well, I mean, for sure, I've been worried about Iran for a number of years now, but what we're seeing today is this new relationship, this co-joining of efforts between Iran and Russia, again playing out in Ukraine, what you and I talked about before, this convergence of seemingly disparate actions with Ukraine as the nexus. And we're seeing probable cooperation between Iran and North Korea over time, and most recently, of course. So it is clearly an area of concern. And I believe the steps need to be taken to rein Iran in.
So let me just add into this. Thank you, Admiral Harris, and thank you for the presentation and questions from Dr. Mansourov. Let me add into this dialogue, a very rich dialogue here on very important issues. You know, Admiral, you talked about, correctly so, about the 70 missiles launched, the drones that flew over the DMZ from the north, and some of the pronouncements from Kim Jong-Un during the plenary session of the Workers' Congress over the last few days. So when you see this exponential increase in launches and a commitment to enhancing in an exponential sense their nuclear arsenal, countries like Japan and South Korea and certainly Taiwan sitting there have to say, my God, are we best prepared to deal with a North Korea that's becoming even more belligerent, and that's determined not to come back to negotiations, and it's enhancing its nuclear capabilities, and it has a new doctrine of preemptive nuclear warfare, where if they perceive a threat, they could possibly even use their nuclear arsenal. So when you look at this and you hear the talk going on in South Korea about South Korea acquiring its own nuclear weapons capabilities, when you read that Japan has committed to doubling its defense budget, when we hear about the United States committing over $10 billion in defensive military aid to Taiwan, we have to all understand that these countries are under threat. So we're talking about a significant nuclear and certainly conventional arms race in the region for obvious reasons. And then you juxtapose that with the United Nations. And Admiral, you spoke very eloquently about what's happening in Ukraine. And Dr. Mansourov talked about Iran, and we see what's happening in Iran with the demonstrations, but also with their nuclear program. And you're wondering, is there a body there? Is there an international body like the United Nations that could bring some of these issues to the fore, and we could sort of start looking for a path to a peaceful resolution of some of the issues? And I cite North Korea specifically because there are UN Security Council resolutions that North Korea continues to violate. And the United Nations Security Council is unable to do anything because China and Russia veto those resolutions. So in many ways, the United Nations is impotent when it comes to consequences for North Korea and a message to other countries. So my question to you, Admiral, is this. If you were advising leaders in Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, and others, what would you say about some of the talk going on about not only enhancing their conventional capabilities, military capabilities, but also possibly looking at acquiring nuclear capabilities, despite the fact that the United States has committed and recommitted to extended nuclear deterrence for all of these allies and partners?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ambassador. Let me try to parse it just a little bit, because Taiwan is in a different case, if you will, than is South Korea and Japan, at least as I view it in regards to the question that you've asked. I don't think that Taiwan faces a daily threat from North Korea. It does from the PRC, but not from North Korea. North Korea poses a daily threat to Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So, I parse it in that regard. Plus, we have a different relationship with Taiwan than we do with Japan and South Korea. I think that my advice to Japan, to all three countries, including Taiwan, if you will, to all three, my advice is to arm up, not nuclear arm up, but arm up conventionally. These countries are treaty allies of the United States. Japan and South Korea are treaty allies of the United States, and they have to trust us on our president's assurances, our country's assurances of extended nuclear deterrence for them. So that should enable them not to have to go down the nuclear path. However, that is only as good as their trust in us is. So do they trust us to abide by our treaty obligations to them, Japan and South Korea? Do they trust us that we're going to live up to our treaty obligations, including extended nuclear deterrence? As long as we commit to that, and that's on us, not on them. As long as we commit to that, then I think that we can have a hope that these two countries won't proliferate in the nuclear sense. On the conventional side, they need to arm up, and they are. Japan's under former Prime Minister Abe, now under Prime Minister Kishida, Japan is increasing its defense budget significantly, and they recognize the threat from the PRC. South Korea is in a different place with regard to the PRC than is Japan, but they clearly see the daily threat from North Korea, and they realize that North Korea's only ally is the PRC. So that puts the PRC in the right place, in my view, as far as South Korea's view of it. But let me touch on something else that gets to the issue of the United Nations and what Dr. Mansourov mentioned earlier. And I believe that diplomats and diplomacy matter. And here we are, over 2 years in to the Biden administration, and we yet don't have an ambassador to India, for example. I'm glad that Ambassador John Sullivan stayed on in post. I'm sorry, in Moscow. I'm sorry that he had to leave because his wife died. But we don't have an ambassador in place in Russia. Again, diplomats and diplomacy matter. It took us 3 years to get an ambassador to Ukraine, and 5 years to Singapore, 5 years to ASEAN. It's hard for us to withstand the criticisms from countries like the PRC when they say these countries don't matter because the United States doesn't have an ambassador in place in them. It took 18 months for Philip Goldberg to follow me to South Korea. Now, Ambassador Goldberg is a fabulous diplomat. South Korea traded up for sure, but 18 months for our treaty ally that's on the front lines in the battlefield, the diplomatic battlefield with China and North Korea and all of that. 18 months to get an ambassador to Australia. It took Caroline Kennedy, who's already been an ambassador once, 18 months to get her there in place. So that's on us, the United States.
Right.
You can blame the divided political landscape in Washington and all of that, but you can't blame the Senate if the White House doesn't nominate people in time. Now, after they're nominated, then you can start to levy some criticisms on the Senate, perhaps, but not until they get nominees at least to look at.
I
So
couldn't
that's
agree
all
with you
us
more.
as a country.
Admiral, I think you're right on the mark. I couldn't agree with you more. Diplomacy is so important in this regard. And I wouldn't give up on diplomacy, certainly with North Korea. And in the context of what we're talking about now, about Japan and South Korea, but the region itself, to include Taiwan, the region itself saying, let's ensure that we have a robust military capability to withstand any onslaught.
That's right.
But that's where one has to wonder, why wouldn't China? This is not in China's interest to see certainly conflict in the region, to see South Korea, maybe even Japan down the road talking about acquiring its own nuclear capabilities. This is not in anyone's interest, certainly not in China's interest. So my question is, I personally would think this would be one of the reasons, one of a number of reasons why China would want to encourage North Korea to come back to negotiations with the United States, with the Republic of Korea, to talk about finding a path to a diplomatic resolution so that we stop this escalation and the possibility of accidental conflict. So my question is, why do you think China is not, or maybe do you think China is indeed encouraging North Korea to come back to negotiations, and Kim Jong-Un is saying, we're not prepared?
Yeah. So look, I think that that China has the potential, probably the only country that has the potential to compel North Korea to return to the negotiating table short of force, short of forceful compellence. But they won't do it. So it's on them. Meanwhile, for the rest of us being, in this case, United States, South Korea, Japan, for the rest of us, you cannot negotiate from a position of weakness. You can only negotiate effectively from a position of strength. And I think that's the lessons that is the lesson that we're learning in the case with North Korea. We can't hope to negotiate from a position of weakness. As I mentioned in my remarks, giving away stuff in the hope that they'll at least negotiate is a fool's errand. That's appeasement, and deterrence by appeasement is simply not deterrence at all.
Admiral Harris, thank you so much for your comments, for answering the
Ambassador,
questions. But,
yes.
Can we end it on one last comment and question from you, Alexander? Then we'll have to cut it.
Yes, it's just a simple question. As we look ahead, Ambassador, I'm very curious about your top 3 predictions for this year, for 2023. I mean, if you can just lift the veil over the horizon for us a little bit. What do you think? Your top 3 predictions.
I was never accused of being a strategist. I deal with it here and now. So I'm simply going to predict that I'll be a year older, my hair will be grayer, and I'll have more wrinkles.
Okay, got it.
That's being a diplomat now. Wait a minute, Admiral. Let's go on this one here. Alexander, why don't you answer your own question? What are your 3 predictions?
My first prediction is that this year will be unfortunately worse than the year which passed. So in that sense, I'm a little bit pessimistic, and there will be no diplomacy, no talks resumed on the Korean Peninsula on the nuclear issue. And of course, the war, this horrible war, it's huge tragedy, which we see today in Ukraine. I think it's going to last another year. And the next New Year webinar, we'll still be talking about that deepening and widening tragedy, which is likely to engulf many more countries, including the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Mansourov. Let me just end this by saying this. My own comment on this would be, I think many countries, many of us will have to come together, the people in all these countries, seeing what's going on in Ukraine, seeing what's going on with the demonstrations in Iran, seeing what zeroed COVID and how the Chinese people rose up and said that they were tired with those lockdowns. Seeing the pushback against a lot of what's going on in the world, and the absence of, as you said in the beginning of this dialogue, diplomacy, and the need to use diplomacy, and to have organizations like the United Nations, the imperative to have organizations to come in and to try to find a peaceful resolution, a path to dialogue. And we don't have the dialogue in Ukraine. We don't have the dialogue with North Korea, as we just discussed today. And we see a lot of these other issues. And we haven't even mentioned Myanmar and some of the other countries here, Sudan, Somalia, et cetera. So there's so much going on. There's a need for the United Nations or any organization like the United Nations to step up. And that would be, I think, a cry from the global community to say, where are the peacemakers? Where is the opportunity for dialogue? And hopefully that will be an imperative in 2023. I want to thank Admiral Harris for just a great session. Dr. Mansourov, as always, you've just been outstanding. Dr. Jenkins, thank you for hosting this for us.
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani, for your moderation and this excellent program today. Admiral Harry Harris, we are proud to be Americans when we see your leadership, both as PACOM commander and also as ambassador. You give us hope with your courage to stand up and speak for what is right. And we're really, really interested to go forward together. I want to thank the Universal Peace Federation, who also helped sponsor this program, and the Washington Times Foundation, and especially I want to thank the Washington Times. They are covering this program today. That means all of our embassies in Seoul will be reading about this, and Tokyo, and I'm sure beyond. And we're looking for solutions. Dr. Mansourov, as always, your excellent interventions and thoughts are very, very helpful. And Ambassador DeTrani, we're honored to be part of your team to bring a better diplomacy and understanding in every sector of the world. And we really want to see peace. Thank you. The Washington Brief is very, very happy to have our program the first Tuesday of every month. Thank you.